My son Colin stood in the middle of our family kitchen on Christmas morning and told me, in front of his wife and my 2 grandchildren, that I had turned his marriage into a battleground. Not Serena Voss, the woman who moved into my son's home 8 months after they married and slowly rearranged everything inside it. Not the debt accumulating quietly behind their renovated walls. Me, his mother, the woman who drove 4 hours every month from Sudbury to help with the grandchildren, who sent money when they asked, who stayed silent when silence felt like kindness. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply set down the dish I was holding, picked up my coat from the hook by the door, and drove home alone through a December snowstorm so quiet it felt like the whole world had agreed to witness my humiliation in peace. My husband Harold passed 7 years ago now. Not suddenly, not dramatically. He went the way honest men often do, slowly, with grace, still worrying about everyone else while his own body forgot how to keep going. Lung cancer. Diagnosed in March, gone by November. He spent his last good months making sure I'd be all right. He called the bank. He organized the paperwork. He made a list of every tradesperson we trusted so I'd know who to call when something broke around the house. That was Harold. The kind of man who prepared for his own death like it was one more responsibility he didn't want to leave half-finished. We raised Colin in Thunder Bay. Harold worked for the railway for 31 years, and I ran a small alteration shop from our garage for most of that time. We weren't wealthy. We were careful the way people who grew up without much tend to be. Every dollar we saved on purpose. Colin watched us do it his whole childhood. I thought he understood what that meant. I thought he valued it. Maybe he did once, before Serena Voss. Colin met her at a work conference in Toronto 3 years ago. She was in marketing, sharp and funny and ambitious in that particular way that can look like confidence until you're standing close enough to see it clearly. I liked her at first. That's important to say honestly. When Colin brought her home for Thanksgiving that first year, I made her favorite dishes, even though I'd only known her for 2 months. I stayed up the night before preparing her mother's butter tart recipe, because Colin mentioned once she loved them. I wanted her to feel welcomed. I wanted to be the kind of mother-in-law nobody complains about. They married quickly, 14 months after meeting. The wedding was in Niagara-on-the-Lake, elegant and expensive in a way that made Harold's brother whisper to me during the reception that the bar tab alone could have paid down a mortgage. I smiled and said nothing. Serena had taste. That wasn't a crime. But within the first year, small things began shifting. Colin stopped calling on Sunday evenings the way he always had. When I visited, Serena was polite in a way that felt managed, like she'd rehearsed exactly how much warmth to offer without giving anything away. She called me Dorothy in a tone that somehow made my own name feel formal, like I was a neighbor who'd arrived uninvited rather than the woman who raised the man sleeping beside her. Still, I told myself I was imagining it. Mothers of sons are warned about this, aren't we? Don't be too close. Don't interfere. Let them build their own life. So I pulled back. I called less. I waited to be invited before visiting. I said yes when asked and kept my opinions inside when nobody asked. Then, about 18 months into their marriage, Serena's brother Fletcher Voss arrived. The first time I met Fletcher, he was leaning against my son's kitchen counter, eating leftover lasagna I had made, and driven down from Sudbury, telling Colin about a real estate investment opportunity in the Okanagan. He was younger than Serena by a few years, handsome in an easy, unearned way, with the kind of relaxed certainty that comes from never having been wrong about anything important yet. He shook my hand with a wide smile. "You must be Dorothy. Colin talks about you all the time." Even then, I noticed something. He said, "Colin talks about you. Not wonderful to meet you, not I've heard so much." Just a quiet acknowledgement that I was a known quantity, a file already reviewed. Fletcher began spending more time at Colin and Serena's house over the following months. Weekends became extended stays. He was between contracts, Serena explained. Between contracts had a way of lasting a long time. He started joining their conversations about money, about investment, about what Colin could be doing differently with what they had. Colin makes good money. He's a civil engineer, solid and careful with it, the way Harold was with everything. He had savings, he had an RRSP. He had the small inheritance we'd set aside for him after Harold died, money from the house we'd downsized out of, 32 years of Halifax life insurance, Savings from a man who stretched every dollar because he loved his son and wanted him to start ahead. Fletcher noticed that too. He proposed what he called a private equity partnership. A residential development project in British Columbia. 6 units, high-demand area. Projected returns of 22% over 30 months. He used words like asset-backed and low exposure and legacy wealth. Every conversation about it arrived polished. Every concern Colin raised was answered immediately. Smoothly, like the objection had been anticipated long before it was spoken. I only found out Colin was seriously considering it because he called me one Thursday evening and mentioned it casually, the way people mention something they've already half decided. I remember I was standing at the kitchen window watching snow settle on the backyard, and something turned cold in my chest before I could identify why. "How much is he asking you to put in?" I asked carefully. $60,000, Colin said. That was most of Harold's inheritance. "I want to ask some questions about this before you decide anything," I said. Colin's voice shifted, just slightly. "That's the first sign you're losing someone." Not anger, just a small tightening, like a door not quite closing. "You always worry, Mom." That was the beginning. Over the next several months, Fletcher became a permanent fixture in their home. He was always there when I visited, always sitting at the head of their kitchen table with his laptop open, talking about growth timelines and market positioning. Serena lit up around him in a way I hadn't seen her do around anyone else, including Colin. She quoted him constantly. "Fletcher thinks we should. Fletcher says the Toronto market is," Fletcher told us. One afternoon I arrived early to watch the grandchildren, Emma and James, while Colin and Serena went to a work event. Fletcher was already there. He looked surprised but recovered instantly. "Dorothy, great timing. I was just going to call you." He had a folder under his arm. We sat in the living room while the children watched television in the next room, and Fletcher walked me through what he called the family investment overview. His company was structuring the deal now. A numbered corporation, registered in Alberta. The money was already partially committed. They just needed one more anchor investor to finalize the structure. "Who's the anchor investor?" I asked quietly. He smiled. "Well, ideally someone with stable assets and longer investment horizon. Someone like you, Dorothy." I looked at him carefully. He was offering me a seat at something he'd already built around my son. "What are you using as the underlying security for the loan structure?" I asked. His smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes adjusted slightly, the way a person recalibrates when a conversation doesn't go where they planned. "These deals are structured to protect everyone," he said. "That wasn't my question." He closed the folder. "I think Colin and Serena were hoping to talk to you together about this." I drove home that evening with a heaviness in my chest that stayed through dinner and through the news and through most of the night. The following week, Colin called to Serena felt I had been rude to Fletcher. I set my tea down slowly. How? By interrogating him. Interrogating. I thought about the 2 questions I had asked while sitting in my son's living room. Questions any reasonable person would ask before signing anything. "I'm trying to understand where your money is going," I said. "Our money, Mom." "That's the thing." Colin's voice carried something new in it, a sharpness that didn't belong to him naturally. It felt borrowed. "Has Serena seen the full legal documentation for this investment?" I asked. Brief pause. Fletcher handled most of the paperwork. I closed my eyes for a moment. "Colin," I said gently, "have you personally reviewed all of it?" He didn't answer immediately, and that silence scared me more than any number could have. I started paying closer attention after that. On my next visit, I arrived early and spent time in the kitchen, with the children, while Serena was getting ready and Fletcher was on the phone in the backyard. I noticed things I hadn't looked at before. Credit card statements on the counter with balances I didn't recognize. A printout from a mortgage broker for a home equity line of credit. A second printout for something called a leveraged investment loan. The children were showing me a puzzle when Emma, who is 7 and observant the way clever children are, said, "Uncle Fletcher says Grandma doesn't understand business." She didn't say it unkindly. She was just reporting what she'd heard. Something went very still inside me. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table in Sudbury with a cup of tea I didn't drink and thought about Harold. He would have known. He had a way of seeing through people that looked like ordinary friendliness but was actually patience. He'd just wait, quiet, until the real thing revealed itself. I'd watched him do it our whole marriage. I called my oldest friend Sandra Hewitt the next morning. Sandra is a retired accountant and one of the most direct people I have ever known. I drove to her house and spread everything I'd photographed on her dining room table. The investment brochure Fletcher had emailed Colin, which Colin had forwarded to me without thinking much of it. The mortgage documents I'd photographed discreetly. The credit card summary. Sandra looked through each page slowly. She didn't speak until she had read everything. Then she took her glasses off. "Dorothy," she said, "when did this man register his company?" I didn't know. She found it in 20 minutes on a public registry. Fletcher Voss's numbered corporation had been registered 14 months ago, just before he began spending serious time at Colin and Serena's home. Its listed assets were minimal. Its one prior venture, a condo presale project in Kelowna, had wound down with a civil dispute still listed as unresolved. Sandra tapped the page. "He's not a developer," she said. "He's a recruiter." "What does that mean?" "It means he finds people with savings and brings them into deals. He takes a placement fee or a percentage structure whether the deal performs or not." My chest tightened. "So whether Colin loses money," Sandra nodded grimly, "he still gets paid." That afternoon I drove to a financial advisor I trusted, a man named Gerald Lawson, who had helped Harold and me plan our retirement years ago. I brought Sandra and the documents. Gerald reviewed the investment brochure carefully and spent a long time on the page buried near the back. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. He said, "There are 3 separate fee layers in this structure: management fee, placement commission, and performance incentive." He pointed at a clause I had not understood. "This clause means Fletcher's company collects the placement commission regardless of project outcome. So, if the project fails," I asked, "he still collects on the funds raised." Gerald folded his hands. "Dorothy, this structure is legal, but it is designed to benefit the arranger, not the investor." I sat very still for a moment. "Does Colin know this?" Gerald looked at me carefully. "Does Colin understand this document well enough to know?" That answer was the most honest and most painful thing anyone said to me in that entire period. I drove home and wrote Colin a letter, not an email. A letter, the way Harold and I were taught to communicate things that mattered. I told him I had looked into the investment structure. I told him what Gerald had found. I told him I was not trying to control his choices, only to make sure he had the full picture before committing Harold's money to something designed to pay another man whether it succeeded or failed. I rewrote it 4 times. The first version sounded accusatory. The second sounded frightened. The third read like a plea. The fourth was just honest. I sent it. 3 days later, Serena called me. Her voice was careful and cold in a way I hadn't heard before. "Dorothy, I think it would be better if you let Colin make his own decisions." I told her I had simply shared information. She said, "Fletcher worked very hard on this opportunity. What you're doing is undermining his confidence. His confidence. Not Colin's well-being. Not our family's financial safety. Fletcher's confidence." I asked her directly, "Serena, have you read the fee structure in the back of that agreement?" Silent. Then, "We trust Fletcher." I ended the call before I said something I couldn't take back. Colin phoned the following evening. His voice was flat in the way it gets when he's rehearsed what he wants to say, and is determined to say it before emotion gets in the way. He told me I was interfering, that Serena felt I had never respected her family, that every time I questioned Fletcher, I was really questioning her judgment, that maybe I needed to consider what my visits were doing to their marriage. That word, visits, landed like something small and deliberate. I asked him once, quietly, whether he was happy. He said, "I'll be a lot happier when my mother stops treating my wife's family like suspects." I set the phone down for a moment after the call ended and stared at the window. Snow again. Southern Ontario winter, relentless and gray. Harold used to make hot soup on nights like this and insist we eat it at the table with the radio on. Because he believed warmth was a choice you made, not a condition you waited for. I thought about that for a long time. Then I called Sandra back. She came over that Saturday with groceries and no-nonsense boots, and the specific kind of patience that comes from a long friendship. We sat together and I told her everything, including the part I hadn't admitted out loud yet. I think Colin has stopped seeing me as his mother. I think he's started seeing me as an obstacle between himself and something he's been convinced he wants. Sandra didn't argue with me. That's how you know someone really knows you. What are you going to do? She asked. I told her I didn't know yet. But I knew what I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to sign anything that put Harold's memory into a numbered corporation, run by a man with an unresolved civil dispute in his business history. And I wasn't going to keep pretending that silence was the same as peace. Christmas arrived the way it always does, whether you're ready or not. I drove down to Colin and Serena's house on the morning of the 24th carrying the grandchildren's gifts and a pot of the beef stew they both loved. I had made Emma the knitted cardigan she'd asked for specifically, pale green with small wooden buttons, something I'd been working on since September. I had made James a set of wooden blocks Harold's brother had helped me hand paint. Ordinary things made with time and love, the only currency I'd ever fully trusted. Fletcher was there when I arrived, of course. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop, a coffee at his elbow, looking entirely at home in my son's house. He greeted me warmly. The kind of warmth that doesn't actually cost anything. The morning started carefully. We opened gifts. The children were happy and loud in the way children should be on Christmas morning. And, for an hour or so, I let myself just be their grandmother and nothing else. Then Serena brought out a folder after breakfast and set it on the table near the coffee cups. She said, "We thought Christmas might be a good time to revisit the investment conversation, in a relaxed way." I looked at the folder, then at Colin. He wasn't quite meeting my eyes. Fletcher leaned forward. "Dorothy, we've actually revised the structure to address some of your concerns. I would need to see it with my own advisor before discussing it further," I said quietly. Serena's expression changed. Not dramatically, just tightened, slightly, at the corners. Colin set his coffee down. "Mom, this family has been patient with your hesitation for months. My hesitation, as though protecting Harold's savings from an unvetted deal was a personal failing." "I'm not saying no to you, Colin," I said carefully. "I'm saying I won't sign something I haven't had independently reviewed." "That's insulting to Fletcher," Serena said. Before I could answer, Colin looked directly at me and said something I will not forget for as long as I live. "You've been trying to control my marriage since the beginning, Mom. Serena knows it. I know it. You can't stand that she has family who actually supports us instead of questioning everything." The kitchen went completely silent. Emma looked up from her toys. James had stopped moving. And then Serena quietly, almost to the room rather than to me. "Some mothers need to learn when to let go." I stood slowly. I put down my tea. I looked at Colin, my son, the person I carried and raised and sat up nights worrying about, and I said, "I hope you look carefully at what you're about to sign. Not for me, for Harold." Then I took my coat from the hook and walked out to my car. I drove north through light snow all the way back to Sudbury. I didn't turn the radio on. I didn't stop for coffee. I just drove and let the road be the only thing that required anything of me. That night, I sat in the kitchen in Harold's old cardigan and thought about what I was going to do next. The following week, I made 2 decisions. The first was that I would not be lending or giving any money to Colin and Serena until I had seen independent legal and financial review of every document involved. I wrote this in a letter and sent it by registered mail so there would be no confusion later about what I had said and when. The second was that I called Gerald Lawson again and asked him to help me formally document the advice he had already given me, in writing, in case it was ever needed. Serena called 2 days after the registered letter arrived. She was angrier than I had ever heard her. She said I was weaponizing Harold's memory. She said I had made her brother feel unwelcome in their home. She said Colin was devastated. I asked her whether Colin had read the fee disclosure clause. She hung up. Sandra came over that evening and brought wine and the kind of quiet company that doesn't require conversation to be useful. We sat in the living room while wind moved through the maple tree outside, and at some point she said, "You know this might get worse before it gets better." "I know," I said. That didn't make it easier. There were nights I picked up the phone to call Colin and then set it down again because I knew that if he cried, or if he said the right things in the right voice, I would find a way to believe everything was fine again. And everything was not fine. I found out what was actually happening through Ryan Castellano, a young man, who had worked with Colin at the engineering firm for 4 years and whom Colin had trusted enough to mention the investment to. Ryan called me one afternoon, awkward and apologetic. because he had done his own research into Fletcher Voss's company after Colin mentioned it at work. He had found the same civil dispute Sandra had. He had also found a forum thread involving 2 other investors from a previous Fletcher Voss venture who described losing a significant portion of their committed funds before the project restructured. Ryan said, "Mrs. Hewitt." He used my maiden name by mistake, and neither of us corrected it. I wasn't sure whether to call, but I thought someone should know. I thanked him, and I meant it completely. That same week, an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "Regarding Fletcher Voss, you should read this." Inside was a forwarded chain of messages between Fletcher and a contact I didn't know from several months earlier. I could not verify who had sent it to me. But the language inside it stopped my breath for a moment. One message described Colin as a reliable close. Another discussed the timeline for getting the anchor signature before year end. A third line read, "The mother is the only variable. She asks too many questions." I printed it and put it in the folder with everything else. 3 weeks after Christmas, Colin called me. He didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded tired, the particular exhaustion that belongs to people who have been holding a performance together too long. He said, "Mom, I think I need to talk to you." I said, "I'm here." He came up the following Saturday, alone. He sat at the kitchen table, same table we'd sat at his whole childhood, and he told me he had finally asked a lawyer friend to look at the investment documents. The lawyer had identified the same fee clauses Gerald had. He had also found something Gerald hadn't mentioned. An indemnity clause that would have made Colin personally liable in certain default scenarios even as a non-managing investor. Colin sat there with his hands wrapped around a mug of tea and said, "I didn't understand what I was reading, Mom." I trusted him because Serena trusted him. I didn't say I told you so. That's not something Harold would have done, and I try to keep to his standard in the moments that matter most. Instead, I said, "What about Serena?" He was quiet for a moment. "She's still defending him. She thinks I got cold feet." I looked at my son across the table. He looked older than he had at Christmas. Something had shifted in his face, not permanently, I hoped, but genuinely. I asked him carefully, "Colin, are you all right?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I don't think I've been paying attention to the right things." That sentence sat between us in the kitchen while the furnace hummed and snow slid softly from the roof. I got up and made more tea. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. Serena did not come around quickly. She felt that Colin's withdrawal from the investment was a betrayal of Fletcher. Of their shared vision of what the next chapter of their lives was supposed to look like. She went very quiet, in the way some people do when they are deciding what they think of you, and I had no way of knowing what conclusion she was reaching. Sandra came over often during that time. Sometimes she brought things to do. Crosswords, a puzzle, a recipe she wanted to try, and sometimes she just sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and let the company itself be enough. That kind of friendship is rare, and I knew it and was grateful for it. One evening, I went to the cedar chest in the bedroom and took out the small envelope I had been carrying in my mind for years without opening. Harold had written several letters in his last months. He'd pressed them into my hands one afternoon in the hospital, with the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything. Most were for me. One had our son's name written on the front, in Harold's careful, slanted handwriting. I had held that letter for 7 years, waiting for the right moment. That night, sitting alone in the bedroom with the winter dark outside the window, I finally read it myself. Harold wrote the way he talked, plain and direct and deeply kind. "Colin," he wrote, "I don't know what you'll be facing when you read this, but I know you, and I know that you have a good heart, and sometimes a heart that good gets taken advantage of. That's not a weakness unless you let it become a permanent condition." He went on for several paragraphs about work and patience, and the particular satisfaction of building things slowly with materials you trust. Near the end, he wrote, "Your mother will push back when she thinks something's wrong. Don't mistake that for opposition. She comes from the same place I do, from people who lost things and learned to be careful. That's not fear, that's earned wisdom. Listen to her even when it costs you something." I folded the letter back into the envelope and held it in both hands for a long time. Colin came back the following month. This time Serena came with him. She sat very upright in my kitchen with her hands around her own tea, and she looked at me in a way that I recognized. Not hostility exactly, more like a person trying to work out whether they owe you something and how much. She said, "I owe you an apology, Dorothy." She said it the way people say hard things they've practiced but still mean. I thought Fletcher was giving us something real. I wanted it to be real. "I understand that," I said. She looked down at her cup. "I said some things that weren't fair. I told her I knew that too. What I didn't say was how much that one phrase, 'Some mothers need to learn when to let go,' had stayed with me. Not because I wanted to wound her with it, but because it mattered. Not letting go of Colin. I have never wanted to hold Colin. Letting go of my own judgment, my own right to ask questions, my own place in my son's life as someone whose concern counted for something. I also didn't say it because Serena knew. I could see that she knew. And sometimes the acknowledgement that lives inside someone's eyes is enough. Fletcher left their lives relatively quietly in the end. Colin withdrew from the investment formally in January. There were some tense weeks of back and forth in which Fletcher made several attempts to re-engage through Serena, but eventually he moved on. That's what people like Fletcher do. They don't linger when a mark becomes more trouble than the return justifies. The civil dispute in Kelowna resolved the following spring in a settlement agreement. Gerald confirmed that the structure Fletcher had been using showed up in at least 2 other complaints filed with provincial regulators. Nothing criminally charged, but enough that an official note was attached to his company's registry file. I gave Harold's letter to Colin on a Sunday afternoon in February. He read it at the kitchen table, while I stood at the counter and looked out at the backyard where the snow had finally begun to pull back from the edges of the fence. I heard him cry before I turned around. Not dramatic crying, just the quiet kind that happens when you hear someone you love say something you needed to hear 7 years too late and exactly on time. We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. He helped me with the dishes. And then we walked around the block together in our coats and boots the way Harold and I used to after Sunday dinners, just moving slowly through the cold air without any particular destination. That spring, Emma helped me plant tulips in the front bed, yellow and red, and one purple variety that seemed like a good idea at the nursery. James mostly threw dirt and was happy about it. Colin put up a new section of fence along the side yard, because the old one had been leaning for 2 winters, and Harold would have fixed it immediately. Serena brought lunch. She had made it herself, a lemon pasta she was trying for the first time, and she asked me halfway through whether the garlic was too much. It was slightly too much, and I told her honestly, and she laughed in a way that was startled and real. That was the beginning of something different between us. Nothing instant, nothing resolved, just honest. Some things don't heal in a season. Trust, once rattled, comes back slowly and in small amounts, like light returning after a long winter. You notice it more gradually than dramatically. A text that arrives without an agenda. A visit that doesn't feel managed. A moment where someone looks at you and you can see they're actually glad you're there. I think about Harold. Often. I think about what it cost him to leave us prepared rather than simply loved, to spend his final months arranging things so that we would be safe after he was gone. That is its own kind of love. The practical and unglamorous kind that doesn't get eulogized the way grand gestures do. He deserved to have that respected. I kept his mug on the shelf beside mine. I'm not ready to move it, and I've stopped expecting that I will be. What I've learned, in the years since Harold died and in the months since Christmas, is that loving someone completely doesn't mean agreeing with everything they choose. It doesn't mean going quiet when you see something your instincts recognize as danger. And it doesn't mean accepting that your judgment counts for less because you are older, because you are their mother, because someone younger and louder arrived and rearranged the furniture. Real love holds its ground. It asks the hard questions and writes the registered letter and reads the fee disclosure clause and drives 4 hours home through a December snowstorm with something still intact that nobody managed to take. And in the end, if you're patient and steady and honest, the way Harold was always patient and steady and honest, the people you love tend to find their way back to you, not unchanged, not without the marks of what happened between you, but back. That, I think, is what matters most.